Hey, good morning. It's Patricia Murphy. It's Wednesday. This is Seattle Now. If you're trying to buy a home here, you don't need me to tell you how tough Washington's housing market is. Some lawmakers think density is part of the solution, things like more duplexes. But as the state considers legislation to help create that density, KUOW's Joshua McNichols is here to explain why it's a lot more complicated than simply building housing. But first, let's get you caught up. The city of Bellevue is suing a couple whose Somerset home slid off its foundation in a landslide last month. The city wants the property demolished as soon as possible. The Seattle Times reports the couple's lawyer says that's not actually the issue. They just want a chance to get out some of their things. An engineering report recommended it be taken down as quickly as possible. Capitol Hill Block Party announced the lineup for its first festival since 2019. Headliners include some big names, indie pop star Charlie XCX and producer Diplo, but plenty of smaller local bands will be there too, including friend of the show Eva Walker with her group, the Blacktones. If you're a first-in-line type, pre-sale is already up. 3-day general admission passes are $150. And if you weren't already clutching your wallet, 3-day VIP passes will cost you $300. Tickets go up in price after Friday, and yes, there is actually a payment plan option. And the Seattle Storm's star forward, Breanna Stewart, will stay with the team for another year. Yahoo Sports says she'll get paid more than $228,000 for that. Guard Jewel Lloyd also re-signed, and Sue Bird used Instagram to say she's returning for her 19th season with the team. Housing in Washington state is prohibitively expensive for many people. And one of the big reasons why is we don't have enough of it. Now, lawmakers in Washington are considering new legislation to help address the problem. KUOW's Joshua McNichols is here to explain. Hey, Joshua, good to have you.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, Joshua, let's just start by talking about what's happening to the housing market in Washington state over the past decade, because we're not just talking about the Seattle area, right?
No, we're talking about region-wide, statewide, even nationwide, this is a problem. But right now we're talking about trying to deal with it on a statewide level. And, simply put, we haven't built enough homes to house all the people who've moved here. And people moving here tend to have higher salaries because many of them move here for tech jobs. And so there's heavy competition for the limited supply of homes. So people without tech salaries, they lose that competition, right? They get outbid for homes. Mm-hmm. Just to get a little sense of what this problem looks like on the ground, in Bothell, I ran into a woman named Rebecca Alvarado who was looking for an apartment so she could live near her daughter. But the search wasn't going very well.
I have found 2 apartments, but still the requirements are that your income is twice the amount of the rent.
What about buying a home? Is that a possibility?
No, not for me. There's no way.
So, what you're hearing there is someone who can't get an apartment and who has no affordable options to start small as a homeowner and sort of work her way up the ladder of home ownership. The only option for her is subsidized apartments, of which there are some, but not enough. Many experts say that the reason why things have gotten that bad is that there are artificial constraints on where housing can be built. And so this limits the supply. Also, we dramatically slowed down how fast we were building housing during the Great Recession, and many experts say we need to speed things up again so we can catch up with the demand.
Okay, let's just reset here for a second. What we are talking about here, Joshua, is inventory at its very base. We're talking about simply not enough places for people to live. And we have this entire chunk of people who are being left out because there isn't enough housing available to them because they're not completely destitute in the eyes of the system, correct?
That's right. And Rebecca, who we just heard from, is low income and looking for housing, but this problem extends to people on middle incomes too. People who are looking for a home that's $500,000 to $700,000, for example. They're also left out.
Okay. And we are a growing area of the country. Washington is a very desirable place to live. So I'm curious, who's trying to solve this problem and how is it going?
Well, a lot of people are trying to solve this in different ways. One of the popular ways right now is by changing the rules around what kind of housing you can build and where. For example, single-family zoning. You may have heard this term floating around a lot. There's a lot of land in many different cities that's basically reserved for one house on one piece of property. A lot of housing experts believe that that artificially limits the supply of housing because it locks away so much land from denser kinds of development. But changing laws around single-family zones is politically difficult. Like, I spoke with an Edmonds city council member who was basically punished for taking a position of advocating to change the system. His name was Luke Distelhorst, and he was all in on reforming the system, and he lost his race in Edmonds last fall. And he thinks his willingness to open up single-family zoning was the biggest reason.
Joshua, this is a really tough problem, and people in single-family homes and single-family home neighborhoods have very strong feelings about keeping those neighborhoods the way they are. Let's talk about solutions, because clearly there's a lot of backlash against people who are proposing new ideas.
Yeah. For the people who believe that this strategy of just flooding the market with supply, one solution they're trying is to make changes in Olympia at a state level and basically going over the heads of mayors and city councils who are responding to their local constituents who disagree with this approach, right? Going over their heads and cracking open single-family zones statewide is one current solution. And the legislators in Olympia want to require that cities allow missing middle housing in single-family zones. Okay,
tell me what missing middle really means, because it sounds like a clever term, but what does it really mean?
Well, I mean, essentially, it's housing that is affordable to people on middle incomes, and it's somewhere between a condo or an apartment and a big freestanding house somewhere. It's a smaller home. Oftentimes, you have many homes sharing one piece of property. Duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, or if you're near transit, small 6-unit apartment buildings. These are inherently more efficient to build just because each unit requires less materials and makes more efficient use of the same land. So it's missing middle because there are so few of these in the market because they're illegal in many places to build.
Okay, now I grew up on the East Coast in a pretty dense area. We had a lot of this kind of housing. We had a lot of duplexes. There were a lot of, row houses with many units in them. Is there anywhere around here that has tried this approach?
Yes. I mean, most cities that are old enough have neighborhoods where you can find some kind of mix of missing middle housing along with the single family zones. There's neighborhoods in Seattle like that. But gradually those neighborhoods have ratcheted up the constraints over the years so that you can't build that stuff anymore. And in newer neighborhoods, you don't see the missing middle housing at all. But I went on a walking tour of Bothell in a neighborhood that's, about 100 years old, that's full of missing middle housing. And it's a little bit more permissive even today than other parts of Bothell. And for example, the tour stopped in front of a duplex, and I spoke with Bonnie Mackay, whose 91-year-old mother owns the building, and her brother Robert lives in the other unit. Mackay told me that little duplex has been at the center of her extended family.
It has housed a lot of family members, like my parents have always lived on one side, and then they've either let kids come and live with them, or at one point they rented out a little bit. But at one time it was a daycare for the grandkids in the family, and they did, just all kinds of stuff.
And, this neighborhood is full of missing middle housing that's been added incrementally over the years. You talked about East Coast cities where you grew up. Many of them are old enough that they've, when you add stuff incrementally, you don't notice the change all at once. And it's a little bit less overwhelming than a neighborhood that's just going through dramatic, rapid change all at once. And so in neighborhoods like this, where that incremental change has been allowed, you can walk around and get a sense of how missing middle can provide affordable options sort of in and amongst the single family homes. And that lets all kinds of people in on all kinds of incomes and kind of lets a wider variety of people stay rooted in a neighborhood.
And looking down the line here, what about the potential for this kind of solution? How much of a dent could it make in Washington's housing shortage?
Well, the analysts in the legislature who look at bills like this and say, this is what it'll do, say this could create between 30,000 and 100,000 homes statewide in the next 30 years. So that's not enough to meet demand, but, so they're going to need to do other things too.
How does this solution, this missing middle inventory solution, solve the affordability problem? What does it matter if you put up 4 units if they all cost upwards of $500,000? That doesn't seem to solve the problem.
Yeah, and actually I'd say even more than $500,000 in many places. Like, you see new townhomes being built. In my neighborhood, they sell for $800,000, in this part of Ballard. So a lot of people see these relatively expensive townhomes going up and say, how is this solving the problem? These seem really expensive. And people carry in their minds a memory of a time when single-family homes cost a lot less than that. And so this seems like things are getting worse rather than getting better as we add all this density. And I feel like understanding that dynamic is a really key question. And it's one that sometimes advocates for these reforms fail to address head on. I mean, their key argument is that if you supply enough housing, the increased supply will force prices down over time. And so they're appealing to our basic understanding of the laws of supply and demand. But the problem with this argument, the thing that it leaves out, is that the number of people looking to move here from more expensive places like New York and San Francisco is potentially endless, is potentially bottomless, because those places are much more expensive than Seattle. This is a pretty good place to live, and there's a lot of people that want to move here, and the demand for housing here is a little bit sort of elastic. Like, as the price of housing here decreases slightly, it could have the effect of attracting more people from these other places, meaning that home prices won't necessarily decrease as much as advocates hope they will. And there are huge benefits to building denser housing. Like, the environmental reasons alone are huge, and denser development supports strong commercial districts too, and that creates jobs. But this morning, I spoke to an expert on the phone who manages community land trusts, who cautioned us against concluding that just because we open the floodgates, the homes that get built are going to be more affordable. In fact, he believes that very few of them will be affordable, and the only way to guarantee affordability is to require it.
Wow. And, Joshua, this doesn't sound like good news for people like Rebecca Alvarado, who never see themselves in a home and are having trouble even affording an apartment. What's it going to take for somebody like Rebecca Alvarado to become part of the housing market here?
Yeah, well, there's so many factors that affect affordability. There's 4 big ones that people often cite, and they all start with the letter L. There's labor, lumber, lending, and land. And this bill addresses the land and how we use it. It encourages us to use that land more efficiently. But it does not correct for economic inequality. And that means that someone like Rebecca Alvarado, who sees no hope of ever being able to afford a home, her needs are not addressed at the fundamental level. So critics would say that this bill needs to do more to guarantee some level of affordability. There's also the question of, like, should the perfect be the enemy of the good? Should a bill have to be able to do every one of these things in order to be passed? Or do we need to sort of incrementally, send a whole bunch of changes through the legislature and hope to collectively address all these things? One thing this bill does do is it creates a wider variety of home types, and that kind of makes it more likely that if we ever get around to addressing income inequality, there's a ladder of homeownership opportunities. Because for better, for worse, the way that people tend to build wealth in this country right now is through homeownership.
Yeah, very true, Joshua McNichols. KUOW reporter Joshua McNichols, really appreciate your reporting on this. Thanks so much.
No problem.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. Caroline Chamberlain Gomez produced today's show. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.